Am I good to go on?
Yeah, always go.
Cool.
Let's welcome up the second and third speaker to continue their team space.
Three, two, one. I think a lot of Auckland Blues material is framed out when you realise that most schools don't actually have the incentive to change in the first place. Because most people probably buy into a system where you get taught physics, most people probably want to learn about chemistry. That means the only thing that changes on our side of the house is that rural communities now teach things like agriculture, now that minority communities are taught things like black history. That's really, really important and that's really, really beneficial. And I think we win the debate off that. What will I do in my speech today? Firstly, I'll talk to you about does schooling get worse? Secondly, does university get worse? And then thirdly, on alternative pathways, and I'll split on that. Firstly, then on setup, what do we hear? We hear that it's not going to be the curriculum, and the curriculum status quo is the best of education, that's really important, and it's a setup to uni. I think firstly, they don't interact with the framing, that's what I flagged in my intros, most schools don't really change. But I tell you that secondly, NCEA isn't the only place in which this is set. This is also set overseas in which things are also bad there. But thirdly, we tell you that why would these resources go away? The government isn't going to delete years and years of work that they did to do this system in general. But we also tell you that, thirdly, teachers just have them, right? I'm pretty sure teachers are going to, burn their textbooks and, put them on a, roast, fire or whatever, because they probably, want to keep their resources. They probably want to keep the work that they put in themselves. But look, and, to the point about, Cambridge, I think Cambridge is only offered to rich schools, and we don't have an incentive to care about rich schools at the point in time that they're already beneficial in society and they already have an extra pathway. This is about students that actually get a change and don't have their parents funding their university education. Alright, on to does schooling get worse? What do they tell us? They tell us basically on private schools, look, I just responded to that, I don't care. But secondly, on low decile schools, I think firstly the government has the incentive to fund schools in general. Look, that's particularly true during this transition, right? It's a relatively big decision, and I think that a government excluding a section of their voter base is just a bad idea, right? I think a lot of people probably care about those that can't afford to go to school and those in low decile schools, and that's just a large population in general. I think that means that it would be very bad if the government just said sucks to suck, you guys just have to suffer with no money. I think the government is likely to provide funding, but B, we tell you that this is a big change, right? I think the government probably wants to make this as smooth as possible, and they want to quiet any backlash as possible by being extremely supportive to these schools and get those benefits there. Secondly, what do we hear about teachers? Look, they tell us that teachers will change and that they're going to be racist and introduce curriculums about racism and things like that. Couple responses. I think firstly, the government's going to pay attention, right? I think at the point in time your kid is taught racism, they're probably going to tell someone. That probably goes to the media, that probably goes to other things like that, and then you get changes in those school systems. Secondly, sense check, right? People care about their jobs, they probably don't want to be fired, but I think principally they teachers enter into the field because they care about teaching people, and that's the reason they go in. That means it is likely to have positive changes for the curriculum for these students in general. That looks like things like the POC material we give you at Clara about Black History Month and how now we don't have whitewash history because all the people at NCEA just make that incredibly bad. I think that also means, and I'll expand on that teachers are, and I'll give an expansion here, teachers are incredibly stressed in status quo. They don't fix that, and I'll prove to you how we get it better and why that's super, super harmful. I think A, teachers on our side are able to play to their strengths, right? The point in time that you're able to teach what you know because you're good at it, it probably means that you're going to be able to do that better. We tell you that B, students just provide less stress to teachers at the point in time that they're more involved into the system, and that's really important. But we tell you C, look, there's probably things like less exams on this side. This is most teachers relatively disagree with things like tests because it makes teachers stressed in general. I think what that means is you're likely to have you probably feel less bad as a teacher at the point in time you're not failing someone all the time. Their comparative is one which the teachers are incredibly stressed. What does that look like? It looks like lashing out at students. It looks like not teaching them to the best of their ability because they're stressed in general. That's really, really important, and I think we can win the debate off that. Alright, onto why universities get worse, but before that I'll take a POI if you have one.
If the subjects taught change on a teacher-to-teacher basis, how can the government assess any microaggressions and racism within their teaching?
Because I think people probably report it, people probably tell their parents, the parents probably go to things like the ODT and newspapers who probably report it. I think also the material I just gave you about why this is a really, really big change and the government has incentives to do things very carefully. It probably looks like someone from Aero going into a school and looking at the curriculums before they get taught. I think that's just like a pretty reasonable sense check. Alright, why do universities get worse? They basically tell us that there's not like the setup to uni and that's really, really harmful. Look, firstly, I think people that want to go to uni still have the incentives to do the prerequisites, right? It looks like them going to a school that teaches chemistry if they want to go into med science. I think it means that B, schools still have the incentive to teach these prerequisites, right? That's because that's probably where the vast majority of people change. Most people probably don't want to go into agriculture. A lot of people might not want to go into trades. That means they're more likely to go into uni, and that means schools still have the incentive to teach that. That's all the material we gave you at Clara. But secondly, like at our worst, I think uni offer things like starting classes, and that probably helps people get into these courses in general. You have things like summer schools. Look, there's like abilities for when people fail school. I think at the point in time where you're not teaching them, you probably still get those benefits there, and that's really, really important. The last thing here is that high schools always have an incentive to prepare people for uni. Like that just looks like socially as well. I think maybe on our side we're able to get classes that teach people about the drinking culture at Otago and why that's harmful and things like that. I think that means you probably get like more knowledgeable about uni, and that probably lowers the fear when you're going into uni, and that's a really, really big benefit at the point in time that's really, really scary. But secondly, engage with all the supplementary material we gave you at Clara, right? The reference with like equalising admissions and the fact that now you don't have to like be rich and be like a straight E student to be able to get into a scholarship, because now it's based off things like how your teachers view you. Now it's based off things like the letters you write about your personal opportunities. Look, we don't forget about the people that work 4 jobs because they have to feed their family in high school, and that's really, really important. I think we can win the debate off that material. Look, I think at the end of that class, we're able to prove to you that uni education is like not that much worse, or even if it is, it's relatively marginal, and then such shouldn't factor into your OA because, like, I don't know, unis don't really change that much in general. Alright, onto alternative pathways. Look, what will this material prove to you? It will prove to you that those that are left out of this current school system because they aren't like functioning well, because they probably have things like ADHD, they probably have things that don't benefit them, they only care about things they're really, really interested in, and that means that when we have alternative pathways, we benefit those students that are left out in their world. What is the context here? Firstly, I think just a massive proportion of our population go into things like agriculture, go into things like trades, go into things that aren't taught in the status quo. These fields are largely unrelated to like the academic subjects that are required in status quo. Like you don't need to know E equals MC squared to like know how to grow grass, right? I think secondly, there's just a problem with internships. What this will do is prove that this point is relatively exclusive and show you why students would prefer like staying in schools that teach this rather than like going into internships. 3 reasons for this. I think A, it's relatively unproductive, right? Students cannot like learn the content before applying in. That means they probably have worse off. That means they might get like a bad reference in their internship. I think at the point in time which you're able to teach students about this, it means they probably get better references, which leads to better jobs, which leads to better outcomes for these students that are already marginalised, and that means you should care about them more. B, I think it just takes away a student's interactive and social life in schools, right? I think at the point in time you go into a culture that's got like 30-year-old men and you're a 16-year-old like female, it's probably quite scary, and you probably would rather stay in a school that actually teaches and caters to that. But I think C, like no objective or reliable measure of performance, and that means that you probably don't know how you're doing. What are the next? I think firstly, there's formally established course for subjects like things like agribusiness and aerospace science. I think what that means, and like the teachers won't have to like make this big change. But I think what is the problem with these subjects? A, they're not engaging enough. B, like they're not at all schools, and C, they just don't set you up enough to go into these courses. That means that there's basis for this teaching there. But secondly, I'll tell you that these interests are relatively centralised, right? The point in time that South Dunedin is like a poorer community and more people go into the trades in that community, and like rural communities have a higher rate of people going into agribusiness and things like this. That means that there's a demand for these schools in general, and that means you're likely to create them. Thirdly, we tell you that students are more likely to stay in school because all the reasons we gave you in the context. Fourthly, you just get more developed things that attract more resources. That deals with a lot of the resource deterioration point. What are the outcomes? Firstly, individuals who prefer these pathways get a greater education and greater resumes. That's really, really important for the future of their lives. But we tell you, secondly, you just get a better quality in these trades in society. You get more productivity, you get more utility, you get more affordability and more quality. Proud to stand.
Thank you to the second affirmative speaker for their speech. Now I'd like to welcome forward the second speaker of the negating team.
Af can't just come up here and tell us that getting the bare minimum was enough. Because as far as we could prove to Y, when you try to educate people, even if you get the bare minimum, as far as you don't get that actual more complex education, that was just generally going to be a big harm. Now then, 4 things I'm going to be talking about. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about the principal, actually 3 things. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about the principal obligations schools have, which is going to be my split point. And secondly, I'm going to be talking about the burden and what they have to stand behind. And thirdly, I'm going to be talking about the outcomes in the schools. Now then, firstly, just going to quickly go into my split point. Here, I just want to quickly tell you why it is very important that schools just try to give the best education possible. And this is for 2 main reasons. Firstly, because you do not consent to school as a child. Consent, when you're being brought to school, is being violated. Secondly, is that it consumes your whole life. Your life is generally very consumed by schools. What this all means is that a school has an obligation to provide the best educational outcomes to you possible, as far as we can prove that we get better educational outcomes to the majority, then we win out in this debate. Now then, let's move on to what they actually have to stand behind, because I think they were a bit confused here. They tried to tell us that there's going to be requirements. 2 responses to this. Firstly, this just isn't a thing, and also we can do this on our side, but we still think that just barely passing or having a worse education is still a harm in this debate. But secondly, I would just say this is contradictory to all of the material on hyper-focusing on passing, on hyper-focusing on just getting all of these results. Now then, the other thing they have to, let's actually talk about what they have to stand by in this debate. They tried to tell you it's not going to be about everyone's going to pretty much do the same thing except for rural areas. The difference with that, they try to pretty much just sort of tell us it's about letting teachers go on a tangent. But the thing is that you still have these strict curriculums on their side. Why is this? 2 reasons. Firstly, is because it's easier. Teachers can't just constantly handle 5 different classes, each with 5 different curriculums. Obviously, then that means you have to have a streamlined curriculum. You still have a streamlined curriculum like NCEA on. They still have a streamlined curriculum on NCEA on their side. It's just going to be a different curriculum, right? So it's still streamlined. But secondly, it's just so now then, the other thing they have to stand behind is that they also have to justify abolishing all, national curriculums as a whole. They can't just stand behind having everything else the same, except just some rural areas changing. They're not medium, they're burden proof, and that's what's going to lose them out in this debate. Now then, let's talk about let's talk about the outcomes of these schools. And here I want to quickly deal with some of their accountability mechanisms on schools. The first thing they told us is that parents will pull out. 2 responses here. Firstly, is that's often difficult because you have to move. It's expensive to move. It's why gentrification exists. It's why lower socioeconomic areas exist. You can't just move into a higher socioeconomic area. You can't just move into a higher socioeconomic area with different schools. You can't just move around everywhere. So oftentimes the situations are limited. But secondly, what if the parents are bad? What if they enjoy this bad curriculum, right? But also I think that parents can just play down and stuff. They also try to tell us that there's the media. I have a couple of responses here. Firstly, is that why would they actually care about what the media thinks of them? Why wouldn't they just care about the local community, which I think is just a much more realistic expectation? I would say they probably care about those parents and the people within that local community. They probably care about the donors. They probably care about the people who are funding their school and keeping them afloat more than just some random media. They then try to tell us that you're going to get more engagement, and here's where I'm going to flip this material. If this curriculum is super catered to minorities, then I would like to say, who is going to want to teach here? Who is going to want to donate? Because I would say some random white guy probably doesn't want to go to a school where the whole curriculum is about specifically catered towards Maori people, right? So then who is likely to be the people that are in this? It's probably likely to be people from that minority community, right? But there's an issue here, because as they've explained it, these people have been historically oppressed. They have historically been in situations where they have been put in where they've been stuck in these lower socioeconomic areas with worse funding, with worse schools. That probably means that they don't have the best education, but also know that those ones that do get that good education, because they have been historically oppressed, that probably means that they have a large desire to then go and get a better life, right? Because they're able to get a better education, they want to try and get their family out of poverty and stuff. So they're more likely to go to those higher socioeconomic schools. They're more likely to go to those schools that can give them better pay, which are not likely to be in these areas with these minority minority communities. That probably means then that you're stuck with that generally means that you're probably not going to be stuck with the best teachers. You're probably not going to have that many people donating because it's just only going to be these minorities that are donating that have historically been oppressed and historically do not have that much financial capital. Yeah. So overall, what that probably means then that the funding and the resources that these schools have just get worse, and that means that students disengage from this. Because yeah, if you're a black student, learning about Black Lives Matter is pretty cool. But when your resource book is falling apart, that's probably the point where you disengage. The point where you ask the point where the teacher can't answer your question. The point where where you just feel like the whole curriculum is a complete mess and it's not teaching you anything. When your resources are falling apart, that's probably at the point where you disengage more. So overall, you're likely to get less engagement on their side of the house. Now then, let's talk about minorities, because I think they just kind of try to say that like, oh, it's only these rural areas that stay, and that the regular areas are still going to teach a good level of education. But material wasn't on just that irregular people would have like worse education, right? Like we also have all of that material on the Teachers by Lucas, which they didn't engage with. But in general, it's about becoming worse for minorities, and this is because there are racist people, right? These racist people can have an influence over these schools. These racist people can then get into these schools, and now that they have these bad incentives, they can go ahead and play on those. They can put that into the curriculum. They can make the curriculum more hated and bad towards these minority groups. So overall, they were likely to get worse. They try to say that funding is symmetric, but there are a few reasons as to why the funding is used worse on their side of the house. But before explaining that, I'll take a point.
Why are there not checks and balances, and why would teachers want to teach horrible content?
I already explained why you don't have any of those accountability mechanisms, but also racist teachers exist. There are teachers that can want to teach these bad curriculums. You give them a much higher capacity to do so on their side, when the whole schools can make a racist curriculum, when these schools can just make these bad things. So then, also note that these people are minorities, right? There's still Maori people within white communities, right? So overall, they don't have much power or sway over these schools. Now then, a few things to say here as to why you need your funding worse. First is that curriculum changes are hard, require a lot of resources, they're quite expensive. You need to hire experts to make. Notice how we have experts to make those curriculums on our side because we have the whole government, we have the whole education ministry backing us up. So on their side, you need to create all these resources. I think they kind of tried to say that you can just grab random resources online. No, you need to do things like ESA study guides. You need to make actual books that go through your full curriculum, go through your education. You can't just hand them a bunch of random resources and say, hey, hopefully what you learn is actually something relevant to our curriculum. No, you need to make specific resources. Then secondly is that teachers are more likely to go to these big schools because now you have to learn an entire new curriculum when you go to these schools. So you're more likely to go to the bigger school, which has more resources, which has which A, will probably pay you more for your hard work, but B, it's probably easier to integrate when they have more resources, when they can set you up easier. So overall, yeah, we're the side that gets better.
Thank you to the second debating speaker for their speech. Just quickly, just a little reminder to the room, maybe to keep the volume a bit lower on the benches just in the audience. Just small room, so make it easier. And now I'd like to welcome the third speaker to continue their communication.
Can I go to the toilets first? Sorry, I'll be back in 2 seconds. Sorry.
I know, actually.
No. It's not. Sorry, Alex. Sorry, Alex. It's with all my ideas.
Okay, after the debate, you guys need to sign the curtain.
Oh, okay.
Pretty solid looking.
Yeah, thank you.
Where's this com? No com.
No comments.
I would like to say that it's legally required.
According to the job so.
This is all about words, yeah. I checked with my boys, it's fine. I started eating more, okay.
I don't know how
I don't have books. I don't want a single law. Can we
That's the
really,
norm.
how does one legally acquire that? I'm curious.
So one doesn't make sure he's no security cameras
Probably
online,
just
and
like
then
this.
walks out and
Anytime
walks.
anyone asks about the car, I'm like 3 lawyers here.
Right.
You just teleported from the guy.
He'll be just like face nearby and just like, look, it's like, they all over the street, honestly.
Right. So you just think take the places no one will miss.
Right.
Yeah.
It's weird.
Alright, everyone. Third speech.
Alright, I'm all good to go. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Neg's case is at best uncharitable, at worst completely bonkers. They try to say our schools will be racist, there will be social segregation, and teachers will somehow teach the most crap content possible. Look, I hate to break it to you, Auckland, but your underlying premise is that teachers are bad, that students are stupid, and schools have no incentives to be good. I am being charitable here when I don't even talk about our regulations as we set up in our model. What that means is most of this is subconscious. What this means is bad teachers have equal incentives to do bad things on their side of the house. Therefore, if they want to talk about it, they are implicitly defending a status quo narrative where teachers are racist, where students are disadvantaged. At least on our side of the house, we give them flexibility, we give them a way out. This is why we fundamentally win this debate. Alright, a couple of questions in my speech. I'll firstly establish a clear framework, try to make everything clear and comprehensible. Secondly, talk about my minorities. And finally, talk about education in general. At the top of my speech, I want to tell you that minorities are the most important people. Alright, firstly, let's talk about framework. Firstly, what do these changes look like? Note that this will frame out most of their aggressive attacks on our case. This looks like probably a history teacher teaching a different topic if they are in a minority group, right? This looks like schools developing a developed agricultural course or maybe an electricity plumbing course if these people in those areas want to go into these pathways. Look, we gave you so many reasons why there is no fundamental incentive to change unless it's necessary. This highlights the scope of this change. If there is no problem, we remain roughly similar. If there is a problem, if students are being disadvantaged, if stuff are not being used efficiently, this is a flexible solution. Next, let's talk about regulations. Look, their case does not engage with this at all. We can set this up into this house with emotion, right? A couple of pathways here. Firstly, governmental funding and regulation. And voters, they have these incentives we proved to you. They try to say we have no funding, but look, I think governments still probably want to invest in education. It's kind of common sense. And like, we still have checks and balances under our side of the house. We have to go through these systems with the government. This looks like if something is going to be racist, someone's going to say, no, you can't do that. And finally, as a long-term measure, we also have students, we also have parents, we also have teachers. This looks like a lot of regulations under our side of the house. Okay, finally, on who changes, I've talked to you about this. Only those with problems are going to change. This is the crux of our case. Where there is a problem, we give you flexibility, we give you solutions. They are welcome to, but they don't have to. With this clear vision in mind, I'll move on. But before that, I'll take a POI if you have one.
Okay. So can they these governments, they then have to let them do whatever they want with the curriculum. Can they always shut down more subtle forms of racism, where an education topic teaches them that Nelson Mandela was maybe more of a terrorist than a freedom
Look,
fighter?
if it's an educational topic, I think teachers will probably have to report it to their principals. It will probably be determined. If you want to talk about subtle racism, microaggressions, look, psychologically, they are subconscious. Psychologically, they exist away from regulations, away from systems. That's not what this debate is about. Firstly, let's talk about minorities. Very little response here. Why is this the most important in this clash? Because they are principally disadvantaged, because we have a principal obligation as society to help them. This is true not only in education, but when we provide their future careers, etc. Obviously, massive influence here. Secondly, because they are disadvantaged, we think flexibility is where fundamentally can make the greatest difference. That means this must be the priority in this debate. All right, the way I'll do this clash is firstly go over all their points before going over our pathways. What did we hear? They said resources disappear. No, they don't. Stuff exists. It's called textbooks. It's called the internet. Even if the content changes slightly, note that I dealt in my framing as to why this won't be ridiculous. You can probably go on the internet and find simple questions. Look, explain E equals MC squared. Explain the historical past of oppressed cultures. We think with all the vast resources online, we can always find something. This is especially true when you take into account of how we are going to change. Secondly, they said social segregation will exist. Let's go, because like each race will just form their own group, right? Look, okay, the fundamental problem with this assertion is that it's a problem which creates backlash, right? If one person finds out this problem, that means it will receive governmental and institutional attention, and as such will be counteracted immediately. 5 pathways: regulation, teachers, students, parents, community. Community is an additional one where like people around the school community will just react to it, right? And they talked about microaggressions. Look, I dealt with this already. This debate deals with explicit content, not subconscious microaggressions. All right, what do we create under our side of the house? Firstly, we create equitable opportunities. Look, if you want an alternate pathway, if you don't care about aqueous solutions and want to farm, we can give you the resources. Even if funding is symmetrical, we are a lot better. Why? Because we are more flexible. We give you more value for the dollar. This means like we create systems, create classes on what you want to learn in farming, not some random physics Schrodinger's equation out there in the scientific field. Secondly, racial minorities. Look, we think they are really important, and especially if you want to learn about the content that's about your past. It's an aspect of your own identity. We think this is exclusive when they are the minority voices and can be heard through a change in the content they are taught in schools. Thirdly, tertiary educations. Look, no response here. We think a minority student who's like lived through difficult experiences deserves a shot at a good education, even if their score was 3% lower. This has massive flow-on effects, like greater opportunities, more equality in the workplace. Note that they do not respond here, and even if you think this is only a chance, this is a chance you simply have to take. Why is this? One, because minorities are important. Secondly, because the implications are massive. Consider one minority working in the top corporation. That has flow-on effects to reduce discrimination. Thirdly, they've shown us no opportunity cost, no damages here. All right, I think we have won this debate when we prove to you minorities are benefit. They simply cannot win when the most vulnerable people are oppressed under their side of the house. Next, let's talk about education in general, which is an alternate pathway for us. Firstly, a friendly reminder on Clara's material on engagement and strengths, right? Look, the changes aren't that ridiculous. It's simply teaching to our strengths, teaching with flexibility in mind. We showed you to very little response why we get better engagement, better passion, and actually learning instead of trying to milk points in an exam. Why is this really strategically important? Because it works on a subconscious level. When the content suits you, it probably affects your performance, affects everything else. Therefore, for NEG to make any ground here, they have to completely defeat this point. Secondly, I'll also respond to their point about tertiary education, right? They tried to say it's probably going to be messed up. There's no objective standard. Look, I think teenagers know what they want to do. If I want to study health science, I'd probably better figure out how biology works. Conversely, if I want to do literature, I should probably read Shakespeare. We think these guidelines are clear because they are in the tertiary education. That is completely symmetric. What is asymmetric is our flexibility. What's asymmetric is not only the minority opportunities we provided you, but when we adapt to create better pathways. Look, that's an additional benefit on top of creating better engagement. At the end of the day, we win on minorities, which they simply have to prove is completely false for them to even have a shot at winning, and we prove we get better education under our side of the house. Proud to affirm.
Thank you to the third fellow speaker for the speech. I'll just sort out the camera quickly before we go on to the next speech.
Would you prefer for the camera to be off with still recording or just not recording? Oh, either that would be pretty easy. Not recording? Oh, okay, then yeah, that's all good. No worries.
Maths case kind of falls apart when they tiptoe between how the curriculum is set, right? Because at no point in any one of their case is that whether it's like set by the teachers who teach it, in which they can choose to help these students in the class, or whether it's by the board of directors. I'll engage with this later in my point. Because what happens instead, what we see when you have a state set or like a school set curriculum, is not only do you have microaggressions when it's set by the teacher, or secondly, there's an inadequate amount of funding for the teachers to be able to give good resources for good education that we promoted to you down the line for them to actually get good education for good jobs. Two things in the speech. Firstly, on whether general education gets better or not, and I'll tie in teachers with this too, and secondly, whether unis get better or worse. Firstly, their main push to us was that education would be tailored more to the individual, right? We've told you 3 responses to this. Firstly, we told you that it's like it fails because it's whether it's unclear if the curriculum is shaping for a single individual, and at that point, if it is, it makes like little sense because like you probably don't want to shape like an entire class just for an individual. But also secondly, note that the funding disappears, as Jamie tells you, because not only do you have like state-funded schools, but the funding disappears because it's proportional on how many individuals actually come to your school, right? When you have less individuals coming because you're teaching a more niche subject, that's where you fail the most. But also thirdly, note the comparative. What we have instead on our side then is a bunch of different incentives for why education around every single level of schooling gets worse. Firstly, let's just look at why private schooling gets worse, right? 3 reasons for this. Firstly, because they want results to justify their cost, so they're likely to like make curriculums easier or more beneficial to them. Secondly, there's an incentive to shift towards more rich donors. And thirdly, note they shift to specific demographics. This was completely unaddressed and kind of washed away at their second and never mentioned again. What we said instead is that education becomes less flexible at the highest institutions or the richest institutions, and this kind of scales down later. Note here, what I'm going to go next is note how like the kind of like curriculum is never addressed, right? But I'll address both comparatives either way. Firstly, let's just analyze why it's worse for teachers if the curriculum is set by the school. 2 reasons for this. Firstly, teachers have less capacity to move to different schools because they constantly have to adapt between different curriculums that they have to teach. This differs drastically, as we've told you, but also it makes it worse for teaching conditions, like I've told you at first, when you no longer have to like have the capacity to easily move, so they're able to actually treat you worse because they know you're forced to stay. But secondly, note that it's much more difficult to help your students when you're unsure of the curriculum yourself, right? This is where all the analysis around like resources misalign, because when you abolish a national system, there is no resource and there is no textbook they can go to because it's completely different, because you no longer can go to the NCEA that they want to. Note then also that it's really bad even if it's set by like the teachers specifically, right? We've told you 3 things. Firstly, note that teachers set awful topics that they believe in, and the only response to was just saying that like they won't because it's unconscious, which still doesn't matter because you're still teaching these like radical topics that you yourself believe in, like the example I gave you at first. But also secondly, note that it's just likely to be much worse when you have no idea of the content you want to teach and you have to teach it yourself. But also thirdly, note that at worst it just jeopardizes the whole class because you're more likely to pan it towards favorites, like they want to tell you about, where you have to like where you care more about the like circumstances rather than the student itself. At the end of this, right, we also see low decile schools in the sense that not only the lower entire, they're more likely to hide their hide their incapacity because they're likely to just like make themselves seem better by making grades more accessible, so they're never actually able to get adequate help. But secondly, there's just no capacity to actually implement this to begin with, right? They have to change when it's abolished, and they no longer have access to textbooks and internet that are actually able to give these students the opportunities. At the end of this, not only do we get better education for all levels of education, but we're able to prove that the national standard is the best way for individuals to learn and upskill to be a better, to improve their lives in the future. Secondly then, let's just talk quickly about whether unis get better or worse, right? The main push at this is that they just have more capacity because you can get letters of recommendation, but it's never fully meched out, right? What we've told you instead is that you should know not only the systematic disadvantages I framed before, but now 3 things. Firstly, it's easier now when you're richer more than ever because you have to go to better institutions who are more likely to give you easier grades to go to these institutions. Secondly, individuals no longer have the adequate resources because the curriculum is abolished, so it's even harder for lower decile schools or students who are poor to reach these levels of institutions. And thirdly, note that the functional skills set by the UA can't be met because they can just set whatever curriculum they want. Unis get more radical, everyone gets worse, and that is why you should negate. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. Now let's welcome the affirmative leaders pride to finish off the debate.
It's just my intro. I didn't have anywhere to put it. Three, two, one. It's very, very unjust to force children to go into schools in which they cannot interact with those that they're not interested in. They should be able to have a say in a curriculum. That's what we provide on Team Otago, and that's where we win. Look, top of my leaders, they didn't engage with the framing we told you, in which schools probably don't change a lot. I think that means that a lot of the material about resources probably falls out of the debate at the point in time that you probably still use similar resources at the point in time you're teaching a similar curriculum. We told you that the schools that do change are those on the margins, those in rural communities, those in South Dunedin, that are now actually able to change. What will I do on my leaders? Firstly, I'll talk to you about resources. Secondly, on minorities, and thirdly, on curriculum. Firstly, then, on resources. Note, top of this is Auckland's only path to victory. If I can prove that there is at least not a significant amount of resource damage, that means that we're able to win on all the other benefits we prior to do in the other clashes I'll talk about. What do they say? They say that there's going to be a very high cost to make changes high and that you're going to have bad textbooks. What did we say? We told you that resources still exist in most curriculums as they're relatively similar. That's what I flagged in my intro. That we don't have to make changes if it's not feasible. That it's a teacher-led curriculum and that moving doesn't make a significant difference. But the exclusive thing we told you that was really, really important was that marginalised schools can tailor the curriculum to be more budget friendly. That goes completely unresponded to, and that's the mechanism we give you at Clara. What does that mean for your OA? It means that because schools can tailor their curriculum to be more budget friendly, it probably reduces a lot of the harm Auckland Blue provides. That means that because this is mainly their only pathway to victory, because they dropped their thing about uni, that means that this is probably like their best material. I think what that means is because this is like a relatively muddy clash and isn't very clear how much damage they get to the resources, it means we can win on the other two benefits. What are those other two benefits? Firstly, then, on minorities. What do they say? They say you're going to have like racist teachers, and then basically the throw-through line is that they're like authoritarian. I think racist teachers and like microaggressions probably exist on both sides of the house because people don't change their morals just because the curriculum changes, but I think it's probably set by teachers, and that means regulated and collaborated on by other people. You don't have a single teacher telling the entire school what to do. What did we say? We told you that university entrance switches to provide equal playing fields and ground to minority. This MEC also doesn't get responded to, and what does that mean for how you should think about this debate? It means that A, because we have better pathways to uni for minorities, this should always be much, much more important than half of the harms they provide. Look, I'm happy to stand by a little bit of tattered textbooks at the point in time that now minorities are able to get scholarships to go to uni, and now they're able to like break out in these toxic cycles. So what does that MEC mean for your OA? It means that firstly, it sets them up for life, right? It means that secondly, it breaks them out of their toxic cycles, and thirdly, it just brings benefits for generations, for years, and all of those people. All of those benefits are what we told you at Clara that go unresponded to. Second thing that goes unresponded to in minorities are the point we give you about disabilities. We tell you that this is super, super important as they're the ones that are forgotten about in Auckland's world. They're the ones that are forgotten about in status quo. Secondly, we tell you that when you actively ignore a subgroup of people and you forget about them, that's a really, really big harm. Look, what's the fault with Auckland's case? The fault is that they forget about people, that they don't care enough to provide these people options to be able to go into uni so that they can provide and like able to interact with the school system, and that's really, really important. Onto curriculum, what did they say? They didn't really engage with this point. Basically, they say that like, oh, there's probably flexibility within subjects in their world. What did we say? We told you that we provide curriculum changes that are not shaped for an individual like they wanted to try and push, but shaped for a community. That's the material we give you at second, when we tell you that often these interests are relatively subjugated to like South Dunedin, to like Mosgiel, to like literally any rural community ever. I think what that means is that probably like deals with a lot of the individual material. Once again, Auckland actively excludes students who are forgotten about in status quo. What happens to these students under their world? It looks like them dropping out. It looks like them not being able to get a job. It looks like all the reasons we gave you on why they're not likely to enter into internships. That means that's really, really harmful, and we can win on both these harms because I think a couple tattered textbooks is nothing compared to the benefits we provide. Proud to stand.
Thank you to the affirmative reply speaker, and thank you to all speakers for their speeches. Now I'd like to invite both teams across the floor and shake hands.
Can I please sign the card?
Absolutely sign the card.
You need to explain how you